On a moonless night in the New Mexico desert, 24-year-old Georg Gartner made a decision that would define the rest of his life. The date was September 22nd, 1945, and the war that had consumed the world for 6 years had ended 4 months earlier. Gartner, a sergeant who had served under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in the Afrika Korps, had spent weeks memorizing the patterns of freight trains that rumbled past Camp Deming. He knew which trains slowed enough for a running man to catch, which directions they travelled, and most importantly, when the guards rotated their patrols. That evening, as darkness settled over the compound, he crawled beneath 2 layers of fence wire and sprinted toward the railroad tracks. Behind him lay captivity in a nation that had treated him better than his homeland ever had. Ahead lay 4 decades as a fugitive, carrying a secret that would make him the last prisoner of war from World War II to remain at large on American soil. The circumstances of Gartner's birth made his escape more than a simple act of defiance against military authority. He had been born in Schweidnitz, a city in Lower Silesia that had been part of Germany for centuries. By the time he crouched in that New Mexico desert, Schweidnitz no longer existed as a German city. The Potsdam Agreement had transferred the entire region to Poland. His childhood home, his family's history, the streets he had walked as a boy had all been erased from the map of Germany. Returning to what remained meant facing Soviet occupation forces who viewed former Wehrmacht soldiers as war criminals deserving execution or deportation to labor camps in Siberia. The choice before Gartner wasn't between freedom and captivity, but between an uncertain future in America and almost certain death in Europe. As his boots hit the gravel beside those railroad tracks, he wasn't merely escaping imprisonment. He was choosing survival in a foreign land over returning to a homeland that no longer existed. Gartner's predicament was shared by hundreds of thousands of German soldiers held in American prisoner of war camps scattered across the continental United States. From the rocky coast of Maine to the sunny valleys of California, 511 camps housed 371,183 German prisoners. The United States Army kept meticulous records of these facilities, documenting everything from daily calorie intake to work assignments to security incidents. Among those records were reports of 2,222 escape attempts by German prisoners who tried to slip past the guards and flee into American society. When the final repatriation ships departed in 1946, military accountants discovered that 7 prisoners could not be located. They had vanished into the vast American landscape, becoming ghosts in a nation that had once been their enemy. Beyond those who physically escaped, thousands more resisted repatriation through legal challenges, deliberate work slowdowns, the destruction of identification papers, and calculated delays that frustrated military authorities. By the time 1946 arrived, American military commanders found themselves in the extraordinary position of using armed force to compel prisoners onto ships bound for Europe, despite those prisoners' desperate pleas to remain in the country that had held them captive. The mathematics underlying this crisis told a story written not in strategic planning documents or diplomatic cables, but in the individual calculations made by tens of thousands of men facing impossible choices. Should they submit to repatriation to Soviet-controlled territories where they would likely face execution, or should they resist and risk punishment in American detention? Should they accept starvation in the ruins of defeated Germany, or pursue illegal freedom in the prosperity of the United States? Should they face certain death under communist regimes that viewed them as fascist enemies, or embrace uncertain futures as fugitives in the nation they had fought against? Every German prisoner held in America performed these calculations, weighing known horrors against unknown possibilities, measuring the value of life itself against the risks of obtaining it. The fundamental transformation of these men's circumstances began on May 7, 1945, when Germany signed unconditional surrender documents and the Third Reich ceased to exist. For the 371,683 German prisoners of war held across the American landscape, the formal conclusion of hostilities meant that their status as enemy combatants had ended. International law and the Geneva Convention demanded their rapid return to their countries of origin. Yet for approximately 123,000 prisoners whose homes now lay behind Soviet lines or in territories ceded to Poland and Czechoslovakia, the end of the war marked the beginning of a different nightmare. The State Department documents that would eventually be declassified decades later revealed that American diplomatic and military officials recognized an unprecedented crisis. These particular prisoners originated from regions that no longer belonged to Germany. The ancient province of East Prussia had been absorbed into the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. The historic regions of Silesia and Pomerania now belong to Poland, their German populations expelled or fleeing westward. The Sudetenland, home to 3 million ethnic Germans for centuries, had been returned to Czechoslovakia. These soldiers and sailors held in American camps had no Germany to which they could return. During July of 1945, as summer heat settled over prisoner of war camps from Texas to Wisconsin, camp commanders began filing reports to Washington describing disturbing patterns among prisoners scheduled for repatriation. Military psychiatrists examining these men documented severe anxiety disorders, depression, and psychological breakdowns concentrated specifically among prisoners facing return to Soviet-controlled territories. The medical officers noted that prisoners from Western German regions showed none of these symptoms, while those from the East exhibited increasingly desperate behavior as departure dates approached. The situation deteriorated to the point where the United States military would eventually execute 14 German prisoners of war for murdering fellow captives suspected of cooperating with American authorities or accepting repatriation too willingly. The official execution records told only part of the story. Dozens of additional deaths classified as suicides were likely murders committed by prisoners who believed their victims were betraying organized resistance to repatriation. The camps had become pressure cookers where fear, desperation, and conflicting loyalties created violence that American authorities struggled to control. The most comprehensive and organized resistance to repatriation would emerge at Fort Eustis, Virginia, where the United States Army established a processing center designed to screen prisoners for Nazi sympathies and prepare them for return to Germany. What military planners envisioned as an efficient operation to categorize and return prisoners would instead become the epicenter of systematic opposition that would require months to overcome. On January 6, 1946, Fort Eustis began processing its first groups of prisoners through a program that would ultimately handle 22,000 German prisoners of war. The facility implemented a controversial 6-day democracy course combined with an ideological screening system that would determine whether prisoners faced immediate repatriation or years of additional forced labor in Europe. The screening protocol divided prisoners into 3 distinct classifications that carried dramatically different consequences. Prisoners designated with white classification were deemed anti-Nazi, having either actively opposed the Hitler regime or demonstrably rejected Nazi ideology during their captivity. These men qualified for immediate return to Germany and release to civilian life. Prisoners receiving grey classification were considered politically neutral, having neither embraced nor actively opposed Nazi ideology. They faced return to Germany but with additional monitoring. Most problematic were prisoners classified as black, indicating committed Nazis who remained ideologically loyal to the defeated regime. These men faced 2 to 3 additional years of forced labor in Britain or France before being permitted to return to Germany. The classification carried enormous weight, determining whether a prisoner would reunite with family within weeks or spend years in additional captivity, performing dangerous reconstruction work in bombed-out European cities. The classification system created immediate problems that its designers had not anticipated. Prisoners quickly discovered that classifications could be manipulated and traded among themselves. White classified prisoners who were young, healthy, and faced minimal consequences upon return to Germany found they could sell their favorable classifications to black classified officers in exchange for cigarettes, chocolate, or other commissary goods. The schemes grew increasingly sophisticated, with prisoners creating elaborate identity swaps that sometimes involved multiple participants. The entire apparatus collapsed when American screeners began noticing obvious discrepancies during final processing. 60-year-old corporals with spotless anti-Nazi records turned out to be 40-year-old SS officers. 20-year-old privates somehow possessed the bearing and knowledge of career Wehrmacht commanders. The age and rank mismatches became so glaring that the classification system had to be rebuilt with stricter identity verification procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Alpheus Smith, who administered the democracy education program at Fort Eustis after running similar programs at Fort Getty in Rhode Island, would later receive the Legion of Merit for his work attempting to convert Nazi prisoners into democratic citizens. Yet even Smith acknowledged the fundamental contradictions embedded in the system. The democracy courses asked prisoners to attend lectures about freedom, self-determination, and representative government, while those same prisoners remained imprisoned indefinitely against their will. The irony was not subtle, and German prisoners of war with philosophical inclinations frequently pointed out that they were being instructed in democracy by guards who held them at gunpoint. Smith's program succeeded in some respects, genuinely converting many young Germans who had been conscripted into Hitler's military without fully embracing Nazi ideology. However, it utterly failed with prisoners who faced return to Soviet occupation zones, as no amount of democratic education could overcome their terror of what awaited them in the East. By February 1946, resistance at Fort Eustis had evolved from individual acts of defiance into coordinated passive resistance that nearly overwhelmed the facility's capacity to function. Prisoners systematically destroyed their identification papers, correctly calculating that they could not be repatriated without proper documentation proving their identities and origins. When the military attempted to reconstruct records, prisoners gave false names, invented birthplaces in Western Germany rather than Eastern territories, and created elaborate false histories that took weeks to disprove. Mass illness reports inundated the camp hospital, with hundreds of prisoners simultaneously exhibiting symptoms that supposedly prevented travel. The medical facility, designed to handle routine health care for a prisoner population, found itself operating at 10 times normal capacity, as prisoners claimed severe illnesses, chronic conditions, and psychological disorders that would require months of treatment before they could be deemed fit for transatlantic transport. To truly understand the desperation that drove such elaborate resistance, one must examine the most ambitious escape attempt ever undertaken from an American prisoner of war facility. The Great Papago escape took place on Christmas Eve, 1944, months before the war ended, at Camp Papago Park near Phoenix, Arizona. The camp housed 3,100 German prisoners, predominantly naval personnel, including submarine crews captured in Atlantic and Mediterranean operations. Among these prisoners was Captain Jürgen Wattenberg, who had commanded U-162 before its capture. Wattenberg possessed qualities that made him dangerous to his captors. He was intelligent, resourceful, and absolutely determined to escape American custody. The escape plan Wattenberg developed required 3 months of careful preparation and the cooperation of 24 fellow officers. They selected 25 men total who would attempt the escape, all officers with navigation and survival training. The technical challenge was formidable. The prisoners had to dig a tunnel 178 feet long, starting from beneath the bathhouse and extending beyond the camp's perimeter fence. The tunnel had to be deep enough to avoid detection by guards walking overhead, yet shallow enough that men could crawl through it without requiring extensive shoring to prevent collapse. The prisoners worked during evening hours when most guards focused on supervising prisoners in the main compound. They excavated approximately 30 tons of soil, which created an obvious problem. Where could they dispose of so much displaced earth without arousing suspicion? The solution demonstrated remarkable creativity. The prisoners announced to their American guards that they wished to construct a volleyball court for recreation. They explained that the ground in their chosen location was uneven and would require significant leveling work. The guards, seeing volleyball as harmless recreation that would keep prisoners occupied, approved the project. Over the following weeks, German prisoners hauled wheelbarrows full of excavated tunnel soil to the volleyball court construction site, spreading it carefully to create a perfectly level playing surface. The guards watched this industrious construction work without realizing they were observing the disposal of evidence from the tunnel being dug beneath their feet. On Christmas Eve, 1944, while American guards attended holiday celebrations and most prisoners staged a diversionary party with singing and festivities, 25 officers crawled through the completed tunnel and emerged beyond the perimeter fence. They scattered into the Arizona desert, moving in small groups toward their intended destination. The escapees weren't attempting to reach Germany, which they knew was impossible. Instead, they planned to reach Mexico, hoping the Mexican government might grant them asylum, or at minimum not immediately return them to American custody. Their geographic knowledge of Arizona proved severely lacking. The aftermath of the Papago escape demonstrated both the determination of German prisoners to avoid captivity and the practical impossibility of successful escape in America. Wattenberg remained at large for over a month, surviving in the desert and slowly making his way south toward the Mexican border. He was finally recaptured on January 28, 1945, after a Phoenix resident noticed a man with a strong German accent asking for directions to Mexico in broken English. The resident contacted police, who notified military authorities. 3 other U-boat officers who had escaped with Wattenberg were discovered after 3 days sitting on a bench in a Phoenix public park, looking dejected and confused. When questioned, they explained that they had relied on their maps showing rivers throughout Arizona that would supposedly provide water and navigation routes to Mexico. Upon arriving in the actual desert, they discovered that Arizona's rivers existed primarily on maps, with most watercourses being dry arroyos except during flash floods. Faced with waterless desert, they had walked back to Phoenix and simply waited to be found. The punishment for all recaptured escapees followed military protocol. Each man received bread and water rations for a number of days, equal to the number of days he had been recaptured, time he had spent outside the camp. Of the 2,222 documented escape attempts by German prisoners from American camps, only Georg Gartner achieved complete and lasting success. After his September 22, 1945 escape from Camp Deming, Gartner caught a westbound freight train to California, riding in boxcars alongside American hobos and migrant workers. During his journey, he encountered a family from Arkansas traveling to California in search of agricultural work. The family's last name was Wiles, and when asked his name by other travelers, Gartner gave the name Dennis, adding the family name of the Arkansas migrants as his own surname. Dennis F. Wiles became his new identity, a name chosen almost randomly, but which he would carry for 40 years. Gartner worked a succession of jobs that took him throughout the American West. He washed dishes in San Francisco restaurants, worked as a lumberjack in Oregon forests, and found employment as a ski instructor at Sugar Bowl in Lake Tahoe. His athletic abilities and personable nature made him successful in jobs requiring interaction with the public, despite his German accent that he worked constantly to minimize. He obtained a Social Security card using his assumed identity, a document that would prove crucial to his ability to live openly in American society. In 1964, he married Jean Clark, an American woman who knew him only as Dennis Wiles. Together they adopted 2 children, creating the appearance of a completely normal American family. Gartner eventually settled in Southern California, where he became a construction estimator and architectural consultant. His work involved preparing detailed cost estimates for custom home construction, a job requiring mathematical precision and the ability to read complex architectural drawings. He built a successful career in this field, designing and managing the construction of custom homes across Southern California's growing suburbs. His business associates, friends, and neighbors knew him as a competent professional, a good neighbor, and a devoted family man. None suspected that Dennis Wiles was actually a fugitive who had escaped from military custody 4 decades earlier. The Federal Bureau of Investigation never stopped looking for Georg Gartner. His name remained on the FBI's wanted list, and J. Edgar Hoover personally signed the arrest warrant that remained active throughout Hoover's decades-long tenure as FBI director. The FBI distributed wanted posters bearing Gartner's photograph and description to 10,000 post offices across the United States, hoping someone would recognize him and report his location. Yet, despite this nationwide manhunt, Gartner lived openly under his assumed identity, participating in his community and even appearing in public situations that should have exposed him. The most remarkable incident occurred in January 1952, when a massive blizzard stranded the City of San Francisco passenger train in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Gartner, working as a ski instructor at Sugar Bowl, joined a rescue expedition organized to reach the stranded train and evacuate passengers. Life magazine, the most widely read publication in America, sent photographers to document the dramatic rescue. The resulting photo spread included images of the rescue team, with Georg Gartner clearly visible among the rescuers. The magazine hit newsstands across the nation, while FBI wanted posters bearing Gartner's photograph hung in post offices in those same communities. The fugitive was hiding in plain sight, and nobody connected the ski instructor helping stranded passengers with the escaped prisoner of war the FBI sought. Gartner's double life continued for 32 years after his escape. In 1984, his wife Jean grew increasingly frustrated with her husband's refusal to discuss his past or his family history. She knew only that he claimed to be estranged from relatives and preferred not to discuss his childhood. The tension in their marriage reached a breaking point when Jean threatened to leave him unless he finally revealed the truth about his background. Faced with losing his family, Gartner confessed that he was not Dennis Wiles, that he was actually Georg Gartner, a former German soldier who had escaped from a prisoner of war camp in 1945. Jean was shocked, but after recovering from the initial revelation, decided to support her husband. Together, they began planning how Gartner might surrender to authorities and resolve his illegal status. In 1985, Gartner contacted historian Arnold Kramer, who had been researching German prisoner of war experiences in America. Kramer recognized the extraordinary nature of Gartner's story and helped him prepare a book manuscript titled Hitler's Last Soldier in America. The book would tell Gartner's story of escape and 40 years living under a false identity. On September 11, 1985, Gartner made his surrender public in the most dramatic fashion possible. He appeared as a guest on NBC's Today Show with host Bryant Gumbel and announced his true identity to millions of viewers watching national television. The government's response to Gartner's surrender revealed the legal complexity of his situation. Federal prosecutors examined possible charges and concluded they had no viable case. Gartner could not be prosecuted for escaping from the prisoner of war camp because escape itself was not a federal crime. Military law prohibited escape, but Gartner was no longer subject to military jurisdiction, as he had been discharged from prisoner of war status when Germany surrendered in 1945. He could not be deported because deportation applied to people who entered the country illegally, but Gartner had been brought to America against his will as a prisoner. He couldn't be charged with illegal entry because he had never technically entered the country voluntarily. The Immigration and Naturalization Service examined his case and announced they had no interest in deportation proceedings. The FBI issued a statement confirming they had closed their investigation and had no further interest in pursuing charges. Georg Gartner, after living as a fugitive for 40 years, was effectively free. In November 2009, at 88 years old, Gartner finally completed his transformation from enemy soldier to American citizen. He took the oath of citizenship in Denver, officially becoming what he had been in practice for decades, an American. He spent his final years living in Loveland, Colorado, finally able to live openly under his birth name. He died in 2013, having spent 68 of his 88 years in the country that had originally held him as a prisoner of war, the country he had fought against, and the country he had ultimately chosen over his own homeland. While individual prisoners like Gartner resisted repatriation through escape attempts, the collective resistance of German prisoners of war triggered a different kind of conflict. American farmers and agricultural businesses fought desperately to retain prisoner labor that had become essential to their economic survival. The statistics documenting prisoner productivity revealed why civilian interests fought so hard against military repatriation plans. During 1945 alone, German prisoners of war harvested 900 million pounds of vegetables across American farms. They picked 568 million pounds of fruit in orchards from Washington to Florida. The total agricultural value generated by prisoner labor reached $230 million, calculated in 1945 currency values. The prisoners received wages of 80 cents per day, which was paid directly to the United States government rather than to the prisoners themselves. Congressional records from February 1945 preserved correspondence from politicians representing rural states demanding that the military provide 100,000 additional prisoner of war laborers to address agricultural labor shortages. The Great Western Sugar Company submitted a formal petition to Congress requesting authorization to retain 30,121 German prisoners of war indefinitely to maintain their beet sugar operations. In Idaho, the J.R. Simplot Company, which would later become famous as the supplier of French fries to McDonald's restaurants worldwide, employed 2,000 German prisoners in dehydrated potato factories that produced rations for American military forces fighting in the Pacific Theater. Labor unions responded to agricultural demands with fierce opposition. The Congress of Industrial Organizations and the American Federation of Labor published newspaper advertisements showing photographs of returning American servicemen who could not find employment, while German prisoners of war continued working in American fields and factories. Union leaders characterized the retention of German prisoner labor as a betrayal of veterans who had fought to defend America, only to return home and find former enemies occupying jobs that should belong to Americans. The dispute created unusual political alignments that cut across traditional party lines. Southern Democratic senators allied with Midwestern Republican farmers in supporting continued use of prisoner labor, while Northern industrial Democrats joined with urban Republicans in demanding immediate repatriation and jobs for veterans. The Farm Bureau Federation, representing agricultural interests, found itself in direct opposition to the American Legion, representing veteran interests. Military regulations governing prisoner of war camps explicitly prohibited fraternization between American personnel and German prisoners. The prohibitions carried serious consequences, with violations potentially resulting in court-martial for military personnel. Despite these stringent rules, relationships developed between prisoners and Americans, particularly in cases where prisoners worked outside camps on farms or in facilities with mixed American and prisoner workforces. The most extensively documented case involved Second Lieutenant Eleanor Powell, an African-American Army nurse, and Frederick Albert, a German Wehrmacht medic assigned to prisoner medical facilities. Powell was one of only 63 black nurses serving in the Army Nurse Corps during World War II. Military leadership assigned black nurses to prisoner of war wards based on the assumption that racial prejudice would prevent fraternization between black Americans and German prisoners. The military's logic held that white German soldiers, indoctrinated with Nazi racial ideology, would refuse romantic relationships with black nurses, thus preventing the fraternization that officials feared. This reasoning proved incorrect. Powell and Albert met at Camp Florence, Arizona in 1944, where Albert worked in the camp hospital. Despite regulations, despite the racial barriers that American society and Nazi ideology both attempted to enforce, the two developed a relationship. When Albert received repatriation orders in March 1946, Powell discovered she was pregnant. The couple faced seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Albert would be forced to return to Germany. Powell could not follow him due to travel restrictions and the devastated conditions in post-war Europe, and their interracial relationship was illegal in most American states. Albert found a solution by using immigration law provisions that allowed parents of American-born children to apply for entry visas. He returned to Germany as ordered, but immediately applied for immigration documents based on his status as the father of an American child. His application was approved, and he returned to the United States in 1947. Powell and Albert married on June 26, 1947 in Manhattan, New York, one of only 16 states that permitted interracial marriage at that time. Research conducted by Barbara Schmitter-Heisler and published in her 2013 study From German Prisoner of War to American Citizen documented that approximately 5,000 former prisoners of war eventually emigrated to America through various legal channels. Of these, an estimated 1,200 married American women, though the precise number remains uncertain because military authorities deliberately suppressed statistics on fraternization-related marriages. The military's concealment of these records makes accurate counting impossible, but oral histories, local newspaper accounts, and immigration records confirm that hundreds and likely thousands of American women formed relationships with German prisoners that led to marriage after the war ended. The terror-driving prisoner resistance had documented origins in Operation Keelhaul, a massive forced repatriation operation that provided horrifying precedent for what could happen to prisoners returned against their will. Conducted between August 14, 1946 and May 9, 1947, Operation Keelhaul forcibly returned 2,750,000 Soviet nationals from Western Allied zones to Soviet control. American intelligence agencies later estimated that 50% of those repatriated under Operation Keelhaul were either executed immediately upon arrival in Soviet territory or sent to labor camps in Siberia, where they died within months. The McNarney-Clark Directive, signed by American military commanders and classified until 1975, explicitly authorized the forced repatriation of individuals without regard to their wishes and specified that force could be used if necessary. German prisoners of war from Eastern territories witnessed Operation Keelhaul's forced repatriations firsthand. At Camp Shanks, New York, which served as a primary processing point for both German and Soviet repatriations, German prisoners watched through camp fences as Soviet prisoners were physically dragged to trains by American military police. Some Soviet prisoners committed suicide rather than board the trains, slashing their wrists or throats with smuggled razor blades. Others fought violently against the military police, requiring multiple soldiers to physically carry each resisting prisoner to the trains. German prisoners watching these scenes understood that they might face similar treatment if they were designated for return to Soviet-occupied territories. The State Department's decision to reclassify German prisoners as surrendered enemy personnel or disarmed enemy forces in June 1945 removed them from full Geneva Convention protections. This technical reclassification allowed the United States to retain prisoners for labor purposes, while technically complying with international law requirements. Military medical records documented 56 official suicides among German prisoners of war held in American camps between 1943 and 1946. However, the International Red Cross, conducting investigations of conditions in American prisoner facilities, reported in March 1946 that the actual number of suicides likely exceeded 200. Many deaths had been classified as accidents to avoid scrutiny and negative publicity. The crisis reached its peak in December 1945, when 5 prisoners at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, hanged themselves within a single week after receiving notification that they were scheduled for repatriation to Soviet zone destinations. The War Department responded by issuing Emergency Directive 411 on January 15, 1946, requiring implementation of suicide prevention protocols at all prisoner of war facilities. The protocols included confiscation of belts that could be used for hanging, removal of razors that could be used for cutting, and prohibition of rope or cord that prisoners might use for self-harm. Agricultural communities across America mobilized to advocate for retaining German prisoner labor that had become essential to their economic survival. Camp Concordia, Kansas, which housed 4,000 prisoners, developed such positive relationships between the local community and German prisoners that the town continues hosting annual reunions attended by former prisoners and their families. Wisconsin's Door County officially credited 2,140 German prisoners of war with saving the entire 1945 cherry crop by picking 508,020 pails of cherries during the critical harvest period. In Texas, where 300,000 agricultural workers were needed to maintain cotton and food production, farmers became so dependent on prisoner-of-war labor that entire communities protested when military authorities announced camp closures. The Spokesman Review newspaper reported multiple cases of communities physically blocking roads when military police convoys arrived to collect prisoners for repatriation processing. On March 15, 1946, at Pier 51 on Staten Island, the Liberty ship General Sturgis waited to transport 1,500 German prisoners of war across the Atlantic to Bremerhaven, Germany. When military buses arrived from Fort Dix carrying prisoners scheduled for departure, longshoremen working at the pier discovered desperate men who had to be physically dragged aboard the ship. Many prisoners refused to walk up the gangplank, forcing military police to carry them. The International Longshoremen's Association threatened to organize strikes rather than participate in loading human cargo that clearly did not want to be transported. The union's position created a moral and practical dilemma for military authorities who needed civilian dock workers to handle the loading operations. Camp Shanks, New York, operated as the primary deportation processing facility for German prisoners being returned to Europe. The facility had been designed to process 1,000 prisoners weekly in an orderly flow from holding areas to ships. By April 1946, Camp Shanks was handling 5,000 prisoners weekly, operating far beyond its designed capacity. The overcrowding and rushed processing created chaos. On April 22, 1946, 30 prisoners scheduled for departure that day soared through wooden barracks floors and attempted to escape through sewage pipes that ran beneath the facility. 27 were recaptured immediately when guards heard the noise and responded. 3 prisoners reached the Hudson River before Coast Guard patrol boats intercepted them as they attempted to swim away from the facility. Navy records documented 17 confirmed suicides during Atlantic crossings between March and July 1946, though deaths classified as accidents or cases where prisoners went missing at sea likely increased this number substantially. The ships carrying prisoners back to Europe travelled without the careful medical oversight that accompanied the original transport of prisoners to America. Prisoners who died at sea were buried with minimal ceremony, and in some cases records simply noted that a prisoner had gone overboard without explicitly determining whether the death was suicide, accident, or even potentially murder by fellow prisoners. The Germany that awaited returning prisoners in 1945 through 1947 offered starvation and ruin rather than homecoming. Official rations in the British occupation zone provided 1,040 calories per day, far below the minimum caloric intake required for basic survival. During the winter of 1946 to 1947, rations decreased further as transportation breakdowns and continued fighting in some regions disrupted food distribution. Infant mortality rates doubled compared to pre-war levels. Former President Herbert Hoover, conducting a humanitarian assessment tour of occupied Germany, reported that mortality among Germans over 70 years old had increased 40% during fall 1946 compared to pre-war averages. 20% of all German housing had been destroyed by Allied bombing, leaving millions homeless. The expulsion of 12 million ethnic Germans from Eastern European territories under the Potsdam Agreement created an unprecedented refugee crisis, with millions of displaced persons overwhelming the capacity of remaining intact German cities to provide shelter. Industrial output in Germany during 1947 reached only one-third of 1938 levels, meaning the economy could not provide employment or produce goods needed for basic survival. Food production had fallen to 51% of pre-war per capita levels, creating widespread malnutrition. For prisoners of war from Soviet-occupied zones, return meant potential execution or forced labor. The Red Army's occupation of eastern Germany had resulted in an estimated 2 million rapes of German women during the final months of the war and early occupation period. Soviet authorities systematically dismantled entire factories and shipped the machinery to the Soviet Union as war reparations, eliminating any possibility of economic recovery in the Eastern Zone. Any German male between 16 and 60 years old living in the Soviet zone faced possible deportation to Soviet labor camps for compulsory labor as additional reparations. Congressional records from 1945 through 1947 documented intense pressure from agricultural states demanding continued retention of prisoner-of-war labor. The Office of the Provost Marshal General, which administered prisoner-of-war programs for the United States Army, responded to civilian complaints about allegedly favorable treatment of prisoners by ending canteen sales and limiting food portions in May 1945. This triggered widespread work stoppages among prisoners who viewed the deterioration of their conditions as betrayal after Germany's surrender. Military officials justified continued detention by arguing that Germany's lack of a functioning government meant no formal peace treaty could be concluded, allowing detention to continue under Geneva Convention Article 75 provisions. The creation of new legal classifications, such as surrendered enemy personnel and disarmed enemy forces, enabled continued labor exploitation while technically avoiding full prisoner-of-war protections and their associated obligations. President Harry Truman ultimately ordered completion of repatriation despite agricultural sector pressure to retain prisoner labor indefinitely. However, delays granted specifically for harvest assistance extended prisoner retention well into 1948 in some agricultural regions. The last German prisoners of war were not returned from America until summer 1946, and many of those repatriated from America then spent additional years performing forced labor in Britain and France before final release to civilian life in Germany. The complete statistical accounting reveals the scale of the crisis. 371,683 German prisoners of war were held in American camps. Military records documented 2,222 escape attempts, though the actual number of attempts was likely higher as some prisoners were never discovered or reported. 7 prisoners could not be accounted for when final repatriation concluded, presumably having successfully integrated into American society or having died without their bodies being recovered. 14,000 repatriations were deliberately delayed for agricultural necessity, technically violating Geneva Convention requirements for immediate repatriation after hostilities ceased. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners eventually returned to America as legal immigrants through various channels. During the 1950s, 580,000 Germans immigrated to the United States. During the 1960s, 210,000 Germans immigrated. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 admitted 415,000 displaced persons by 1952, including 60,000 Germans. Many former prisoners of war were among these immigration numbers, though precise tracking remains impossible due to inadequate immigration record-keeping and the stigma that discouraged former prisoners from revealing their wartime status. The economic impact of prisoner labor was undeniable. Prisoners provided 14 million man-days of agricultural labor during their captivity. They processed 100 million board feet of lumber in forestry operations. The total labor value they generated reached $230 million, measured in 1940s currency. Each prisoner generated 80 cents per day in wages that were paid to the United States government rather than to the prisoners themselves. German prisoners worked in 46 states, filling critical labor shortages across the entire national economy. They built infrastructure, harvested crops, processed timber, and maintained industries that would have collapsed without their labor. Communities that employed prisoner labor often became the strongest advocates for allowing prisoners to remain permanently in America. The Special Projects Division operated as the United States military's secret re-education program designed to convert Nazi soldiers into democratic citizens. The program reached 40,000 German prisoners through intensive education efforts. Program officials published Der Ruf, meaning the call, a newspaper written entirely in German that promoted democratic values and criticized Nazi ideology. The program distributed books that had been banned in Nazi Germany, allowing prisoners to read materials promoting democratic philosophy, criticism of totalitarianism, and alternative political theories. After Victory in Europe Day, 25,000 prisoners graduated from intensive democracy courses and were returned directly to Germany instead of facing additional years of forced labor in Britain or France as punishment for having supported the Nazi regime. Camp newspapers proliferated across the prison system, with 135 different publications produced at various camps. By 1945, 8 of 20 major camp newspapers still advocated Nazi ideology and promoted continued loyalty to Hitler's vision. The majority had shifted toward discussions of democracy, reconstruction, and how Germany might rebuild as a peaceful nation integrated into the international community. Notable graduates of the re-education program included Walter Hallstein, who would become president of the European Commission and architect of European economic integration. Hans Kroll participated in the program and later served as West German ambassador to the United States, promoting German-American cooperation. Rüdiger von Wechmar attended democracy courses while a prisoner and eventually became Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations, representing his reconstructed nation in the international forum dedicated to preventing future wars. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 provided the first clear legal pathway for former prisoners of war wishing to return to America as immigrants rather than prisoners. Between 1948 and 1952, approximately 5,000 former German prisoners of war successfully immigrated under various legal provisions. The requirements for immigration included securing American sponsors willing to guarantee financial support, providing proof of non-Nazi party membership, and demonstrating means of self-support through employment offers or marketable skills. Barbara Schmitter-Heisler conducted extensive research on this population, including 35 in-depth interviews with former prisoners of war who became American citizens. Her research, published in various academic journals, documented their successful integration into American society. Many became prosperous business owners, engineers, architects, and community leaders. Their children and grandchildren now constitute a significant portion of German-American families, though most descendants remain unaware of their ancestors' prisoner-of-war origins. After leaving America, German prisoners faced additional years of forced labor in European reconstruction. Britain received 175,000 German prisoners who worked until 1948, with 25,000 choosing to remain in Britain as civilian workers after their release. France received 740,000 German prisoners who were retained for reconstruction work until 1949, far beyond the Geneva Convention's requirements for rapid repatriation after hostilities ended. These extended detentions violated international law, but Allied governments justified them as legitimate war reparations, arguing that Germany's aggression entitled victim nations to compel labor from German soldiers for reconstruction of damage Germany had caused. The last German prisoners were not released from Allied custody until 1949, 4 years after the war's end, when international pressure and changing Cold War dynamics made continued detention politically untenable. Published memoirs and oral histories provide documented evidence of prisoners' experiences and their desire to remain in America. Lewis Carlson's book, We Were Each Other's Prisoners, published in 1997, compiled extensive documentation of widespread desire among German prisoners to remain in America rather than return to Germany. In 1985, a major reunion held in Austin, Texas, attracted over 500 former prisoners who returned to America specifically to revisit the locations where they had been held captive. Their testimonies, carefully preserved in historical archives, consistently described treatment during captivity as better than their experiences as civilians in post-war Germany. Arnold Kramer, who spent decades interviewing former prisoners for his research, noted that 95% of interviewed former prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent, a remarkable statistic given that these were enemy soldiers held against their will. Most remarkably, thousands of former prisoners maintained regular correspondence with American families for decades after repatriation, writing letters to farmers, guards, and civilians they had befriended during captivity. The transformation of German prisoners from enemies into potential citizens appeared repeatedly in government reports analyzing the prisoner program. The State Department acknowledged in various assessments that prisoners exposed to American democracy and prosperity inadvertently became ambassadors for American values upon return to Germany, promoting democratic ideals in their devastated homeland. Military intelligence reported that prisoners who worked on American farms often developed stronger loyalty to their host communities than to defeated Germany, viewing America as offering opportunities that Germany could no longer provide. These observations influenced post-war policies toward enemy combatants and displaced persons, establishing precedents for how America would handle populations displaced by future conflicts. While precise statistics remain elusive due to military suppression of fraternization data, documentary evidence confirms hundreds of relationships between prisoners and American women led to marriages. The Immigration and Naturalization Service received over 3,000 inquiries from American women seeking to sponsor former prisoners for immigration between 1946 and 1950. Most applications were rejected based on regulations that excluded former enemy combatants from standard immigration quotas. However, approximately 1,200 former prisoners eventually married American women, either by returning through legal immigration channels years after repatriation or by meeting American women during later visits to America as tourists or business travelers. Of the 2,222 documented escape attempts from 371,683 prisoners, the 0.6% escape attempt rate represents remarkably low numbers compared to prisoner of war escape rates in other nations during World War II. Most escapees were recaptured within 24 hours of their escapes. The vast distances between camps and major cities, language barriers that made escaped prisoners instantly recognizable, and the absence of underground support networks made successful escape nearly impossible for German prisoners in America. 7 prisoners remained completely unaccounted for when final repatriation was completed, their fates unknown. Besides Georg Gartner, at least one other escaped prisoner lived successfully under an assumed identity for years. Kurt Rossmeisel lived as Frank Ellis in Chicago for 14 years before surrendering to authorities in 1959. His case received minimal publicity compared to Gartner's dramatic television confession decades later. The other 5 unaccounted prisoners presumably either died during escape attempts with their bodies never recovered, or successfully integrated into American society under false identities so effective that their true origins were never discovered. The possibility that former German soldiers lived out their lives in America, raising families and becoming respected community members without anyone ever discovering their true identities, remains historically plausible. Communities that fought to retain German prisoner labor often prospered economically from their contributions. The J.R. Simplot Company, built partly on foundations laid by prisoner labor in Idaho potato processing operations, eventually became a billion-dollar agricultural empire. Agricultural techniques introduced by German prisoners, particularly advances in irrigation and sugar beet cultivation, transformed American farming practices in several regions. Many former prisoners who returned as immigrants decades later became successful entrepreneurs, using their understanding of American business practices gained during captivity to build prosperous companies. Several founded businesses that became major employers in their adopted communities, contributing to local economic development. The resistance of German prisoners to repatriation significantly influenced American Cold War policy development. Their terror of Soviet occupation provided vivid validation of American concerns about communist expansion and Soviet brutality. Stories of forced repatriation became powerful propaganda tools demonstrating communist totalitarianism. The principle that people fleeing communist oppression deserved special consideration, first established during debates over German prisoner repatriation, became embedded in American immigration policy for the remainder of the Cold War. This precedent directly influenced American treatment of Hungarian refugees fleeing Soviet invasion in 1956, Cuban refugees escaping Castro's revolution after 1959, and Vietnamese refugees displaced by communist victory in 1975. Of 511 prisoner of war camps scattered across America, very few physical remains exist today. Most camps were quickly converted to other purposes or demolished when the military no longer needed them. However, their impact on local communities persists through museums, historical societies, and annual reunions that continue decades after the war ended. Algona, Iowa maintains a prisoner of war museum documenting the camp that once operated there. Camp Hearn in Texas preserves original barracks and displays artwork created by prisoners during their captivity. These memorial sites attract descendants of both prisoners and guards, creating ongoing connections that span multiple generations and transcend the wartime enmity that originally brought Germans and Americans into conflict. Historians widely consider the German prisoner of war experience in America to be among the most successful examples in history of transforming military enemies into democratic allies. Arnold Kramer's assessment that America won the propaganda war through sheer reality rather than deliberate propaganda reflects the scholarly consensus about why the program succeeded. The transformation occurred because American authorities demonstrated rather than preached democratic values. Prisoners witnessed American prosperity firsthand, experienced democratic processes in camp self-governance structures, and received humane treatment that contrasted sharply with their expectations. Their conversion from Nazi soldiers to democratic citizens occurred through observation of American society rather than through heavy-handed indoctrination that would have triggered resistance. The last organized repatriations occurred during summer 1946, though individual cases extended years beyond that period. Military records confirm that 14,000 prisoners had repatriation deliberately delayed specifically for agricultural work, clearly violating Geneva Convention requirements but justified as necessary for national food security. Ships carrying unwilling prisoners back to Europe reported widespread despair among their human cargo. Captain Harold Morrison of the transport ship Marine Phoenix documented hunger strikes, suicide attempts, and episodes of mass hysteria among prisoners convinced they were being transported to Soviet ports for transfer to communist authorities rather than to Western Germany, as promised. Former prisoners of war played significant roles in Germany's post-war reconstruction. They brought back American agricultural methods, business practices, and democratic ideals learned during captivity. Their direct experience with American prosperity provided concrete models for economic recovery that influenced West Germany's transformation into an economic powerhouse. Walter Holstein, who received his education at Fort Getty, helped design the European Economic Community that would eventually evolve into today's European Union. Hans Kroll, imprisoned at Camp Shelby, dedicated his diplomatic career to fostering German-American relations. Rüdiger von Wechmar, held at Camp Hearn, promoted international cooperation and German reintegration into the international community through his work at the United Nations. The National Archives maintains extensive records documenting German prisoner of war camps, though many documents remain classified under various justifications or were destroyed according to standard military record disposal protocols. Surviving materials include camp newspapers, thousands of photographs, administrative records, and correspondence. Various universities and historical societies have developed extensive oral history collections containing recordings and transcripts of interviews with former prisoners and American personnel who worked in the camps. These testimonies, recorded before most participants died, provide irreplaceable insights into daily life, relationships within camps, and the complex dynamics between captors and captives. The legal precedents established during prisoner repatriation debates continue influencing military and immigration law. The Supreme Court case Johnson v. Eisentrager confirmed broad military authority over enemy combatants held by American forces. The controversial reclassification of prisoners as disarmed enemy forces created legal categories still debated in international law discussions about the treatment of captured enemy personnel. These precedents directly influenced how America handled prisoners in subsequent conflicts, including Korea, Vietnam, and more recent military engagements. Fundamental questions raised about forced repatriation, the rights of prisoners who face persecution if returned to their homelands, and proper interpretation of Geneva Convention obligations continue affecting military detention policies and sparking legal debates. Academic research has documented lasting impacts on communities that hosted prisoner of war camps. Towns that developed positive relationships with German prisoners often experienced unexpected economic benefits from return visits by former prisoners and the establishment of sister city relationships with German communities that sent prisoners to those specific camps. Sociological studies discovered measurably reduced prejudice and increased international awareness in communities that had significant interaction with prisoners compared to demographically similar communities that never hosted camps. These effects persisted through multiple generations, influencing local attitudes toward immigration and foreign relations decades after the war. Military intelligence agencies thoroughly documented the various resistance methods prisoners employed to avoid or delay repatriation. These included systematic destruction of identification documents, feigned illnesses requiring extended hospitalization, organized work slowdowns and strikes that reduced productivity, trading classification categories among prisoners to help committed Nazis avoid detection, deliberately failing democracy course examinations to avoid being classified as suitable for immediate return, and mass non-cooperation at departure points requiring use of physical force. While these resistance techniques proved ultimately unsuccessful in preventing repatriation, they delayed the process substantially and required extensive military resources to overcome, diverting personnel and equipment that could have been used for other occupation duties. The International Red Cross conducted investigations of conditions during forced repatriation operations, expressing serious concerns about potential Geneva Convention violations. Their March 1946 report documented severe psychological trauma among prisoners facing forced return to Soviet-occupied territories where they feared execution or deportation to Siberian labor camps. American military chaplains who witnessed and participated in forced repatriation operations reported profound moral conflicts between following military orders and protecting prisoners from likely persecution upon return. Their testimonies, preserved in military archives and some published in religious journals, revealed the deep ethical struggles that occurred within the repatriation system, with some chaplains requesting reassignment rather than continuing to participate in operations they viewed as potentially sending men to their deaths. The German prisoners who resisted repatriation after World War II represent more than individual acts of desperation or isolated incidents of military disobedience. Their resistance constituted an inadvertent validation of American democratic principles and prosperity. Their overwhelming desire to remain in America, even as prisoners without legal status or rights, provided powerful testimony about the comparative appeal of American society versus the devastation and oppression awaiting them in Europe. They had witnessed American prosperity during their captivity, observed democratic processes in action, and rationally compared these experiences to the certain suffering that awaited them in Soviet-occupied territories or the ruins of defeated Germany. Of 371,683 German prisoners held in America, 2,222 attempted escape, 7 disappeared permanently into American society, and approximately 5,000 eventually returned through legal immigration channels. These numbers tell a profound story about transformation on both individual and national scales. These men arrived as enemies, soldiers who had fought to destroy the democratic nations allied against Nazi Germany. They left when they could as converts to the democratic ideals they had once opposed. Some left as prisoners being forcibly repatriated despite their desperate resistance. Others left with intentions to return as immigrants. A fortunate few never left at all, melting into American society and living out their lives in the nation they had fought against. Georg Gartner's 40-year odyssey as America's last fugitive prisoner of war perfectly symbolizes this broader transformation. His successful integration into American society, despite living under an assumed identity, demonstrated conclusively that former enemies could become productive, law-abiding citizens indistinguishable from native-born Americans. His 1985 surrender and subsequent citizenship in 2009 provided a form of closure to a historical chapter that began when the first German prisoners arrived in America in 1943. The economic arguments for retaining prisoner labor created serious conflicts with competing values and interests. The $230 million in agricultural value prisoners generated, the critical labor they provided during wartime shortages, and their essential role in maintaining American food production conflicted sharply with organized labor's legitimate demands for employment opportunities for returning American veterans. This fundamental tension reflected larger unresolved questions about American values, the balance between economic necessity and moral obligations, and how international law should constrain national self-interest. The documented relationships between prisoners and American women that resulted in approximately 1,200 marriages challenged both wartime prejudices and military regulations designed to prevent exactly these human connections. These relationships transcended nationality, ideology, and military discipline, creating emotional bonds that survived decades of forced separation. The fact that hundreds of American women fought bureaucratic obstacles for years to reunite with men they had known briefly during the war testifies to the power of these connections. Operation Keelhaul's forced repatriation of Soviet citizens cast a horrifying shadow over German prisoners from Eastern territories who witnessed these operations. Seeing Soviet prisoners physically dragged to trains, hearing their screams and pleas for mercy, watching some commit suicide rather than return to Soviet control, convinced German prisoners that resistance offered their only realistic chance of survival. The McNerney-Clark Directive's explicit authorization of force without regard to individual wishes validated their deepest fears about what American authorities might do to them. Fort Eustis's democracy screening program that processed 22,000 prisoners through ideological classification systems created more resistance than cooperation. The fundamental irony of teaching freedom while denying it, of promoting democracy while exercising arbitrary authority, was not lost on intelligent, well-educated German officers who pointed out these contradictions to their American instructors. The program succeeded with some prisoners, but utterly failed with those facing return to Soviet occupation zones, for whom no amount of democratic education could overcome terror of certain death or imprisonment. The devastation awaiting prisoners in Germany, with rations providing barely 1,000 calories daily, cities reduced to rubble, and Soviet occupation forces implementing brutal repression, made even imprisonment in America seem preferable to freedom in Germany. This stark reality drove the suicide attempts, escapes, and organized resistance that military records documented so thoroughly. When men view prison as preferable to freedom, the catastrophe of their homeland becomes undeniable. Congressional debates over prisoner retention revealed fundamental American conflicts between agricultural necessity and labor rights, between economic pragmatism and international legal obligations, between immediate economic benefits and long-term moral principles. The eventual decision to delay 14,000 repatriations specifically for agricultural purposes demonstrated that economic interests sometimes prevailed over Geneva Convention requirements, establishing precedents about how America would balance competing interests in future conflicts. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 finally provided legitimate legal pathways for former prisoners to return to America as immigrants rather than fugitives. The approximately 5,000 former prisoners who successfully navigated this process became American citizens, successful business owners, and respected community leaders. Their integration proved that former enemies could transform into loyal citizens, validating American confidence in democracy's power to convert opponents through demonstration rather than coercion. The broader immigration numbers, including 580,000 Germans in the 1950s and 210,000 in the 1960s, reflected how prisoner experiences influenced German perceptions of America. Many immigrants had heard stories from former prisoners about American prosperity, opportunity, and freedom, influencing their decisions to seek new lives in America. These population movements fundamentally shaped German-American relations for generations. Former prisoners who achieved prominence after the war, including Walter Hallstein, Hans Kroll, and Rüdiger von Wechmar, demonstrated that enemies could become allies through exposure to democratic values. Their contributions to German reconstruction, European integration, and international cooperation validated the investment America made in their education during captivity. They became living proof that democratic conversion through humane treatment and educational opportunity could transform even committed opponents. The preservation of camp histories through museums, reunions, and archives maintains connections between former enemies long after wartime hatreds have faded. Annual gatherings in places like Algona, Iowa, and Hearne, Texas, celebrate transformation and reconciliation rather than dwelling on past conflicts. These events attract elderly former prisoners, aging American guards who once supervised them, and younger generations seeking to understand their ancestors' experiences. Historical assessments consistently conclude that American treatment of German prisoners, despite controversies surrounding forced repatriation, succeeded in converting enemies into democratic allies. The program worked because it relied on demonstration rather than indoctrination, showing rather than telling, allowing prisoners to observe American society and draw their own conclusions. This approach proved far more effective than heavy-handed propaganda would have been. The legal precedents established during prisoner repatriation debates continue influencing military detention policies in contemporary conflicts. Questions about prisoner rights, the legitimacy of forced repatriation when persecution awaits, and proper interpretation of Geneva Convention obligations remain intensely relevant in modern warfare and terrorism detention debates. The principles established during German prisoner repatriation continue shaping how America handles captured enemy personnel. The story of German prisoners who refused to leave America ultimately transcends military history to become a profound statement about human nature and political systems. It reveals humanity's fundamental desire for freedom, opportunity, and dignity. These men, transported to America as enemies in chains, discovered in their captivity what they had been ordered to destroy, a society offering hope and possibility despite their status as prisoners. Their resistance to repatriation validated American principles not through deliberate propaganda, but through their desperate desire to remain. In choosing America over repatriation, they chose possibility over certainty, unknown futures over devastating pasts, hope over despair. They arrived in chains, prisoners of war transported across the Atlantic against their will. Many fought desperately to stay when peace returned, and military regulations demanded their return. A few succeeded in remaining permanently. Their transformation from enemies to citizens stands as powerful testament to America's capacity for redemption and renewal, and to democracy's appeal even to those who once fought against it. The prison camps intended merely to contain them became unexpected doorways to new lives. The nation they had fought to destroy became the homeland they refused to leave. This documented story, verified through military records, congressional testimony, immigration documents, and historical research, demonstrates that even in the aftermath of terrible war, human transformation remains possible. Enemies can become allies, Prisoners can recognize freedom even behind barbed wire, and human dignity can survive even war's devastation. The German prisoners who refused to leave America didn't merely escape from something. They escaped towards something, toward a future they desperately wanted, despite all obstacles.